Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going to Gettysburg to the building pictured here. This is the farm of Daniel Klingel. Life dates 1839 to 1893, and his family. They lived in this farmhouse, which was along the Emmitsburg Road in a conspicuous part of the Gettysburg battlefield. There's a lot of fighting around the building, a lot of wounded men, and other horrific scenes. In 1892, Klingel shared his reminiscences of what he saw during the battle as the fighting unfolded with a friend of his named J. Newton Durboran, who was a friend and also a Civil War veteran. Durboran served in the 1st Pennsylvania Reserve Infantry, which is also known as the 30th Pennsylvania, and also served in the U.S. Signal Corps. Klingel himself went on late in the war to fight in the 209th Pennsylvania Infantry. So that 1892 reminiscence appeared in a newspaper, and it's worthy a read. It's quite interesting. So I want to share it with you. Before I do, a special shout out to Phil Spoggy. Phil is a senior editor of Military Images, a new senior editor, and a new columnist. His new column is called Of Arms and Men. He's writing about the intersection of photography and weapons during the war period. So his inaugural column is coming out in our summer issue, which will be published next month. So way to go, Phil. And thank you for finding this really interesting story. So let me dig in and read it to you. Remember, this story is written by Klingel, but it's told or it's passed along to Durboran, who sent it to the newspaper. The newspaper is called the National Enquirer, and he shares it with the newspaper and asks them to publish it. So here we go. I wish you to publish the following reminiscence of the Battle of Gettysburg given me by D.H. Klingel, that's Daniel Klingel, a citizen of that place at the time of the fight there, who later on in the war became a soldier, as I mentioned earlier, the 209th Pennsylvania. He took things very deliberately, was cool in everything he did, except in getting down off of Little Round Top. Little joke there by Mr. Durboran of the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves. And here's what Mr. Klingel has to say. Mr. Klingel states that he lived in the house between the Sherfy house and the Roger house and the east or southeast side of Emmitsburg Road. And I know that it was so during the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863 that he saw the troops passing during the first day of July, but his recollection is that it was at a later hour of the day that there was a halting in the marching columns, and all at once there was a swinging of axes at all the posts on the left side of the road. And after a few strokes by each, one push, and all along sent the fence flat, and out on the left the troops spread over the Smangler farm and across by McWilliams they went at the double quick. Klingel says all the statements he has seen give the hour at 1 or as early as 11 a.m. He thinks it was near 3 p.m. when the fence was cut down. His neighbor, Sherfy, came to his place that evening, told him that there was too much excitement to kill a calf that Mr. Klingel was going to kill. Mr. Sherfy said, "Keep it till tomorrow evening, and I will then take a quarter." On the evening of the 1st, when the Union Army fell back, they brought 14 or 16 wounded Confederates to his house and laid them on the floors of the rooms of the lower story. There was no one left to care for them. That he, Klingel, gave them water and bathed their wounds during the night. The wounded men called for doctors. He went to see several, but none would go with him. About the middle of the day, July 2nd, he was notified by one officer after another to leave. that he gave all the same answer. If I must die, I will die at home. At last, an officer insisted that they must either go to the cellar or leave. There were plenty of soldiers that would help carry the two children and their clothing. Mr. Klingel started with his family, and when down on the Trossel farm, an officer came riding obliquely directly toward Mr. Klingel. The officer was bareheaded, and as soon as he was within reach, he grabbed Mr. Klingel's hat, and Mr. Klingel grabbed the horse's bridle. The officer told Mr. Klingel that he was in the charge and had lost his hat and could not get another then, and that Mr. Klingel could. Mr. Klingel said it was the only hat he had and that he did not know where to get another. The officer paid Mr. Klingel, asked if it was enough, and left him. Klingel brought his family to the foot of Little Round Top. This is on July 2nd, where they thought they were safe. And he started for home again to get a bag that was filled with his wife's best wearing apparel and some of his own. While on the way in Trossel's woods, he met his neighbor, Shurfy, who wanted to know what he had done with his hat, told him he could not get home, that the rebels charged, and when he left, they were fighting all around Klingel's house. Mr. Klingel returned to his family, came across a pool of muddy water in which was a soldier's cap. He fished it out, washed the mud off, and put it on his head and passed to the left of Little Round Top. An officer stopped him and took him on top of Little Round Top. Mr. Klingel looked through their glass and told the men the rebels were putting their wounded of the first day in names of roads, distances, and where they led to. And it was not long till the first gun of the rebel battery at Warfield's blacksmith shop on the extension of Seminary Ridge, opposite Little Round Top, was fixed. It was not long before the signalmen squatted behind rocks and began to slip away, and Mr. Klingel followed suit. This is about the time, I'm going to interrupt here. This was about the time that Gouverneur K. Warren was on the way or already there. It was not long till signalmen squatted behind rocks and began to slip away, and Mr. Klingel followed suit. It was getting too noisy to be comfortable about that time. Mr. Klingel then went to his family, and they went to friends along Rock Creek. And on the 4th of July, it took him nearly half a day to get from Round Top to his house. The pickets would stop him, take him to their officers until he was nearly at Gettysburg. Then he went zigzag until he arrived at the house. There were Union officers sitting on chairs around the house and would not let him in for a long while. He then gathered up what chairs he could find, took them into the house. Later in the evening, another neighbor named Eckenrode came to his place and asked for his wheelbarrow. Mr. Klingel said he looked for it, could not find it. Mr. Eckenrode said the soldiers found his last barrel of flour and that it was half empty. They were carrying it in their caps, canteens, and in their hands. Mr. Klingel told him to go home and secure it. He would be down, and they then carried it to Mr. Klingel's, and they baked pancakes without salt. And as the soldiers smelt them, they surrounded the house and coaxed and pled for cakes. They kept baking for a while when Eckenrode suggested that their families needed something to eat when they would get home. One soldier would not leave the window, and Mr. Klingel went to him, broke his cake in two, and gave the soldier half. He, the soldier, shoved a $5 bill into the room, refused taking it back, said money was no object then, that he was sick, and had nothing to eat for 2 days. Nearly everything was taken or destroyed. Mr. Klingel strolled all around on the battlefield to find his 2 cows and a calf. He found the hide of one cow with part of the front quarter of meat attached to it on the Trossel farm. On Sunday, he saw some dead soldiers under an apple tree in the lower part of his orchard. A shell had struck the tree, splintered it all to pieces, and the limbs had fallen all around the trunk. He notified the officer in charge of the party who were burying the dead, and the officer ordered the men to clear the limbs, and around the tree were 4 dead soldiers. They had a pan with a portion of cake remaining in the pan, showing that the explosion of the shell had killed the 4 men while they were enjoying their meal. 1 month after the battle, Mr. Klingel heard where his other cow and calf were, about 2 miles northwest from his place. Every place he inquired for his cow, the folks got angry at him, said they had lost all their cattle too. He got the cow and calf, and Mr. Sherfy got his quarter of veal. He could never get pay from the government for any property except $2 for a small lot of hay that an officer had taken. Mr. Klingel says that the Army, during the battle, made so many changes that it was hard for those that were living there before the battle to recognize places, and it certainly would be more difficult for entire strangers to do so. He says that Mrs. Klingel baked for the officers during the 1st and 2nd days of July and could not bake as fast as they came, the officers paying in advance and then waiting till the bread came out of the oven. 2 of the officers disputed about who was to get what was then in the oven. They finally agreed that, as Mrs. Klingel decided, it should be. Mrs. Klingel was called and explained that one officer had paid when she put the bread in the oven and that the other paid afterward and was to get the next. But what was in the oven was not the next, and it was satisfactory. Mrs. Klingel died soon after the war ended. Mr. Klingel now lives at 809 Madison Avenue, Baltimore, and would like to know whether the officer that took his hat, the poor sick soldier with whom he divided his cake on the night of July 4th, 1863, or any of the other officers or men who called so unceremoniously on him and his family are now living, and whether they recollect any of the incidents above related. He would be pleased to hear from any of them. He says he has read a great many statements that purport to be true histories of the Battle of Gettysburg, and has seen but one that mentioned his house, while the Roger House and the Sherfy House are mentioned in nearly all of them in connection with the troops of the Third Corps. He says there must have been fighting in and close around his house, for there were plenty of bullet holes in the weatherboarding and the marks of burnt powder, and about 20 of them inside of the house. That there were many dead lying on his property, all bloated and so black they could not be recognized on the 4th of July, 1863. There were 2 lying inside of the gate in the front yard, which was about 8 feet wide. Others lying around the building. 2 were lying together under the porch, heads resting on a sack that had hair. They're ready for mixing in the mortar. Must have crawled there after being wounded and died. Mr. Klingel says he turned over the soldier that lay in the gateway. His hat was under his head, and a bullet hole through the band of the hat and the head of the soldier. So there you have a rather graphic and vivid account of what happened at the Klingel farm, pictured right here, as told by Daniel Klingel, who was the owner of the farm. His wife and his 2 children were there. The part that I found particularly interesting was how he fled from the house to Little Round Top looking for safety sometime on July 2nd. The fighting happens that afternoon. And he also talks about the Signal Corps. And the Signal Corps were on Little Round Top when Gouverneur K. Warren, who, as you students of the Civil War know, is preserved in a memorial, or a memorial of him is on one of the big rocks on top of Little Round Top. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of life on the Civil War Research Trail.